Hi, scholars. So, in this module, we are going to look at how World War II transformed the United States and how those changes led directly into the Cold War, which is one of the most important global conflicts of the 20th century. So, this is covering chapters 23, World War II, and 24, the Cold War. So, as you listen, think about this kind of big overarching question: how does a global war reshape a country, and what happens after the war ends? So much like World War One, the United States was very hesitant to get involved in the war. So we followed a policy of isolationism, meaning we tried to stay out of foreign conflicts as far as like war conflicts, right? If it benefited us financially, then we would choose a side economically, but not war, if that makes sense. Like we wouldn't help fight, but we would send money or we would buy things, that kind of thing. And so many Americans still remember the cost of World War One, which was just a few decades before, and didn't want to get involved in a war again. However, events in Europe and Asia made that really difficult, and dictators like Hitler in Germany, the militarists in Japan were expanding very aggressively. And then you have like Mussolini in Italy. And so the US began supporting allied countries through programs like the Lend-Lease, which sent supplies without officially entering the war. However, you probably know this and you've studied this, that turning point came December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And this was the event that finally pushed the US fully into World War II, because that's when Roosevelt went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war on Japan. Because we declared war on Japan, Japan had a treaty with Italy and Germany. If anyone declares war on one of the three of us, it's called the Tripart Treaty. If they declare war on anyone, Japan, Italy, or Germany, they declare war on all of us. So by us declaring war on Japan, that meant that we also declared war on Italy and Germany. So what happens at home? Remember, we were in a Great Depression. So once the US entered the war, life at home is going to change very dramatically. First, the war ended the Great Depression. Factories began producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies, creating millions of jobs. And the economy boomed in the 1940s because of this. Women entered the workforce in large numbers. Here you can see here, women of color also entered the workforce, taking jobs that had traditionally been held by men. And this was a major shift in American economy and the American society. And at the same time, the government increased its role in everyday life. So rationing limited access to goods, propaganda encouraged support for the war, and citizens were expected to contribute through war bonds and conservation. You even had like kids doing like victory gardens. So while the war brought economic growth, it also brought greater government control and social change. So even though the US was fighting for freedom abroad, many Americans did not experience equality at home. So African Americans launched what's known as the Double V campaign. So a lot of times if you see African Americans in World War II pictures, they're doing this, Double V. So victory at home, or victory at home for civil rights, and then victory abroad, winning the war. So victory against fascism overseas and victory against racism at home, essentially. And this marked an important early step in the modern civil rights movement. Mexican Americans also contributed through different programs, but they also face a lot of discrimination. One of those is the Zoot Suit riots. You'll read briefly about that. And one of the most serious injustices was the internment of Japanese Americans who were forced into camps. We didn't call them concentration camps, we called them internment camps. And although these Japanese Americans were US citizens, they were still forced into these camps. And this showed how fear and racism could override civil liberties. So overall, the war exposed major contradictions between American ideals and reality. World War II was fought on two major fronts. You have the war in Europe that was happening, and then you have the war in the Pacific that was happening. Right? So in Europe, Allied forces defeated Nazi Germany with key moments like D-Day. And then in the Pacific, the US used an island hopping strategy to push back Japan. And you'll read more about island hopping and what that meant. And the war ended in 1945 after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Japan. So the fighting in Germany had ended a few months before we actually dropped the bombs. So we don't drop the bombs until like August. But in Europe, that fighting had already ceased. We were just ending things in the Pacific. But by the end of the war, the US had emerged as a global power. We had the strongest economy, we had a powerful military, and we had global influence like never before. And that takes us into what's happening right after World War II. So the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly fell apart. Here are the big three of the Allies. So here you have Winston Churchill, he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Roosevelt, President of the US, and here we have Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, right? So these three, but what happens is we kind of have this natural break between these two, which represents Europe and the US, and between the Soviet Union. Although we were allies during World War II, that quickly fades because of what's happening after World War II. There's a lot of mutual misunderstandings. There's some democracy versus communism. There's politics and voting that happen, especially like in Eastern Europe, that the Soviet Union tries to influence, and you're going to get into all of that when you start chapter 24. But these two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, had very different systems. So in the US, we supported capitalism and democracy. The Soviet Union supported communism and one-party rule. Both sides showed distrust in each other and believed the other was trying to expand its influence, which is true. Both were trying to expand their influence. And this tension led to the beginning of what is known as the Cold War that lasts from 1945 until about 1991. And it's a conflict that wasn't fought directly between the US and the Soviet Union, but it played out in hot wars around the world. So think of like the Korean conflict or the Korean War was during this time. The Vietnam War was during this time. The Cuban Missile Crisis. These are all things that are like hotspots happening all over the place during this tension between the US and the Soviet Union. So our policy was containment, and that aimed to stop the spread of communism. And two key examples that you're going to read about are the Truman Doctrine, provided aid to countries resisting communism, and the Marshall Plan. That's where we send $13 billion to help rebuild Europe to prevent instability in Europe. In the US, we also formed alliances like NATO, and we began building up our military. This is a map of NATO, and you'll see this in your textbook as well. In the Cold War, it became a real military conflict during the Korean War. It's also known as the Korean conflict because we don't actually declare war on Korea. Instead, it's fought by the United Nations, but almost 90% of the United Nations soldiers that fought in this war were the United States soldiers, like US soldiers make up most of this. But it does become a real military conflict, and Korea is divided into two. You have North Korea, that's communist, and South Korea, that is backed by the US. North Korea is going to invade South Korea, and when that happens, the United Nations, under the guise of, the US under the guise of the United Nations is going to intervene. The war ends in a stalemate, but it showed that the Cold War could lead to some real fighting, some real conflict. And it didn't just affect foreign policy. The Cold War also impacted the life of the United States. And we have this fear of communism led to what's known as the Red Scare, where people were investigated, blacklisted, or fired for suspected political beliefs. And this period showed how fear can influence government actions and really limit freedoms and civil liberties. You're going to read about this guy, McCarthy and McCarthyism. The Cold War became like a worldwide struggle too. So you have countries that get involved like Africa, Asia, and what we consider the Middle East gained independence through decolonization, but the US and the Soviet Union competed for its influence. So the US often intervened in other countries to prevent the spread of communism, shaping global politics for decades. So what's the big picture? Like, what does it all mean? World War II gets us out of the Great Depression and transforms the U.S. economy and also the society. We have soldiers coming back from different backgrounds, African American, Hispanic, Native American. They're all going to start to look at democracy differently. And we're going to start to see the roots of civil rights movements within all of those groups being planted in the 1940s and really take off in the 1950s and 60s. It also pushes the United States into a position of global leadership at the end of World War II. But again, it exposes all those inequalities at home, and it's going to lead directly to the Cold War. By the early 1950s, the United States was not just a powerful nation, it was deeply involved in a global conflict that would shape the modern world. So, as you move into and you start reading on your own chapters 23 and 24, think about this. Do you think the US gained more from World War II or faced more challenges because of it? And why do you think that is?